They were down to the last bowl. Before dawn, the kitchen was a map of hunger. A single tin plate with a smear of dried milk, a cloth napkin folded over its empty heart, the kettle cold and rimmed with dust. Rosa pressed both small palms against the scarred table, as if she could feel hunger in the wood, as if the grain of oak might give beneath her fingers. Mateo's shirt hung loose on his narrow shoulders. His cheekbones were a little sharper than they had been last spring. When Emiliano stepped off the porch, he kept his boots quiet on the warped boards. He had the habit of watching them breathe before he let himself move, measuring what the morning asked for and what he could give. "We're out of time," Rosa said, almost to herself, the sentence more a fact than a plea. In the dim light, her voice sounded like the soft scrape of wind against the house. He did not answer right away. Emiliano stood with his hand on the porch rail and let the horizon tell him what the day would be. Dust hung low and brittle over the pastures, the kind of weather that made hands crack and horses cough. The sky was a flat, tired blue. Out on the corrals, his mare nosed at nothing, and then shook her head as if to fling the thought away. The house made a small, human sound, the slow creak of a hinge, the ticking of the old clock in the parlor he had not wound for weeks. People in town would say he was steady, some would say he was stubborn. He understood both words and had lived them like a coat. The children were his, no one could question that. He had been their father and their mother since the fever took Lucia 3 winters back. He had learned to do things with one hand if the other still wanted to hold an empty ghost. Braid hair, boil thin soup, keep faith in quiet ways. His hands remembered every chore, every small domestic trick. Now those hands trembled more often when he bent to mend a fence or cup a child's chin to see if fevered skin had cooled. Hunger looked different on a kid than it did on a man. It made them small in ways Emiliano could not ignore. There were notices nailed to the corral gate, paper weathered at the edges, official-looking, stamped with a town seal and the expected language of ultimatum. Feed or lean, pay or the town takes the cattle. The sheriff's name, the signature of a local merchant, Lorenzo Beltran, crisp and clean at the bottom. Lorenzo had the right suit for every misfortune and the right smile for every debt. He ran his general store like a ledger and lived like a verdict. Folks said he'd been born with an eye for what the land could give and a jaw set for taking it. Where Lorenzo stood there was always the feel of paper sliding over wood, the rustle of accounts being settled to his favor. He had shown up twice in the last month, once to praise the state of the horses, once to measure the weight of silence. Both times he left with a promise, and both times that promise sounded like a notice pinned to Emiliano's life. Aurelia appeared on the lane like a woman who had always lived in the light that came before any storm. She was a hired hand who had stayed longer than the seasons, a neighbor who mended his fences without asking. Her hair was braided low, threaded with gray that refused to be ashamed of itself. There were small lines at the corners of her eyes that told of laughter and worry in equal measure. She carried a bundle of feed in a burlap sack, the smell of it bare and honest, haunted straw, a little molasses, the faint musk of grain. She had seen the notices at the gate and did not flinch when Emiliano turned his head toward her. "You shouldn't have," he said simply. "You've been giving me more work than coin for months," she answered, and there was no chastisement in it. Her voice was practical, it fit the morning. "Consider this a loan." He tried to refuse. His pride was the kind that had been quieted by loss, not eradicated. It still rose sometimes when he went to sleep. But Aurelia set the sack by the pantry door and set both hands on his forearm like a brace. She did not pity him. She shouldered what pity can't do and turned it into action. "You can pay me back," she said, "when the rains come, when things are easier." Emiliano looked at the bread box, empty, at the children's faces. He felt the ledger of his life flattened to a single column, feed now, consequences later. He had been bred to answer with work, to fix what could be fixed. Words alone would not fix the sheen of hunger in his children's eyes. He owed more than feed. He owed them time and the promise he had made to Lucia to keep them safe. That promise carried weight heavier than any ledger. "Stay for coffee?" he asked, and it sounded inadequate and like an offense against the urgency of the morning. Aurelia shrugged, wiped her palms on her skirt, and went inside as if she had already accepted. Inside the kitchen they worked with small motions that said more than conversation. Emiliano set the kettle on the stove. Rosa and Mateo moved about in the way children move when they are trying not to look like a problem to be solved. A chore here, a sweep there. The coffee was thin, more bitter than sweet, but sitting at the table with Aurelia and Emiliano turned the small room into a council room. There were papers scattered, the notices, the sheriff's letter, a list Emiliano had scratched out of numbers and wishes. Aurelia read them like a woman checking a boot for a stone. "If Lorenzo takes the hay, you'll lose the winter feed and the animals will go thin," she said. "Then the sheriff will have reasons for everything else." "He has reasons already," Emiliano said. His voice sounded far away to him, like a line from a dream. He thought of Lucia's laugh, the way she would sing under her breath while fixing a fence. He thought of the last night, how she had smiled at the children and told them to sleep. Memory had a way of turning simple things into holy relics. A neighbor, old Thomas, leaned his cane against the kitchen door and shuffled his thin frame inside, offering a rumor like a wedge of truth. "Lorenzo's been talking with men from the South Road, grainier folk. Heard they'll be passing through in a week. Only sells to those with coin up front, or ones willing to bring something else." Emiliano's eyes narrowed. The word else had a weight to it. It could mean labor, it could mean livestock, or it could mean the sort of thing you didn't barter lightly with. A deed, an oath, a life rearranged. The sheriff's deadline read like a clock. 10 days. 10 days to secure enough feed, sell enough hides, borrow enough, do anything enough to keep Lorenzo's men from coming with a writ. 10 days to avert a small disaster that would become large and slow and irreversible. 10 days to refuse the image of his children's bellies hollowing further. After the men left, with the faint smell of their tobacco and the echo of their boots in the dirt, Emiliano took Rosa's hand in his and found the scrape on his palm where a new blister had been forming. He had always been a man who measured life by calluses. Those marks told stories. Today they read like a map to a single point: the barn. The last of the stored hay sat like an accusation beneath the rafters, measured, trotted, and counted. He ran his hand along the rough boards and could feel the grain of the wood as if it were a pulse. The town's gossip would say his options were few, hands tied. Tied hands, however, still had wrists, and those wrists could pull free if the rope frayed in the right place. He had been planning and saving in the background, selling off small things: a gun, an extra blanket, some plates he had not used since the winter of the fever. Every sale had been a quiet sacrifice that left a thin scar, the kind that makes a man twice as careful with what remains. Aurelia stayed the afternoon. She tended the children while he went to check the herd. When Emiliano rode out, the corral smelled of old hay and the metal of rust. Every animal there was an index of their survival. He walked between the pens, counting like a prayer. The mare that bore him would stay with him only if he could keep a roof over her ribs and a palatable mouthful during the next lean spell. He had to think not only of today, but of the slope ahead. A sale now might feed them next month. But what then? On the road to town, the dust rose like a question mark. Emiliano watched the town edge closer, a line of clapboard and tin roofs that looked like a small thing against the vast land. He had been to Lorenzo's store many times to barter, to argue prices, to buy, and to take credit. The shop was a place where paper and commodity met like two strangers shaking hands. Lorenzo greeted him with a smile that did not reach his eyes, the sort of smile that weighed a man and said what he would pay. "You are late this season," Lorenzo said, his voice a blade in a velvet case. He measured Emiliano as a man measuring a piece of leather, holding it up to see if it would suffice. "You left a notice," Emiliano replied. He was careful with his words. They were one of the few currencies he had left. "Yes," Lorenzo said, "a notice for the sheriff. I'm a man who keeps accounts straight." His hand moved in a small arc as if closing an invisible ledger. Around him, the store smelled like oil and citrus and the faint iron tang of coins. "There are men coming from the South Road with grain. Market's thin and they prefer cash, or trade in good standing." Emiliano tried every option. He spoke of the mare and the foal, of the children needing starch and milk. Lorenzo wore patience like armor. "What else?" Lorenzo asked at last. The question hung between them like a scale. Emiliano thought of the land, of deeds and scent of Lucia's hair. The deed to the small patch of earth he called home sat with his name written across it, the kind of name that held memory. He had thought of selling it in the nights, closing a chapter so his children could open new pages, but that idea felt like betrayal. The land was the last thing that remained of Lucia, besides the stories he told the children in the dark. To sign it away would be to cut a seam he could not stitch. "You could join a drive," Lorenzo said suddenly. "There's one leaving at the moon's full, dangerous flatlands, good money for a man who rides steady. Or you could take the south road yourself and buy direct from the merchants. It shortens the trip, fewer hands between you and grain." Emiliano knew the southern road by reputation. It had a name the older men did not say aloud, the Cut. Once, an old tale had told of a man who rode it to get to a merchant faster, and found himself breaking camp with a hole in his ribcage and no horses left. Bandits, winter deserts, men who lived by taking the last coat off a man's back. It was the kind of route younger men rode to make a name for themselves, if they came back at all. "And the drive?" he asked. That option meant leaving the children with others for a season in exchange for payment. It meant work, and a man with a work-stiffened soul could trust work. But it also meant leaving, and leaving meant absence, and absence would be a kind of slow theft from their childhood. It was not the life Emiliano had promised. Lorenzo's smile did not change. "Both are honorable enough," he said. "Choose what's necessary, or sign over your deed, and I can front you enough to feed you through winter. But you'll sign over more than dust that way." Emiliano left the store with the world tilted. Options like cliffs lined the road home. Aurelia was waiting on the porch when he returned, the sky slanting into late afternoon. She had been speaking quietly to the children, handing Mateo a handful of stale crackers. The sight of them, alive and small and still his, was a blade that cut clean through speech. "What did he say?" she asked simply. He told her. Neither of them spoke of the dead woman who had once been their center. Only the memory of her entered their sentences like a scent. Emiliano thought, ride the cut, join the drive, or sign the deed away. He saw the forms of those futures. Each one moved him through the possible shapes of loss. That night the clouds gathered like the backs of beasts. A storm rolled in with a sudden clatter of far lightning and the smell of iron. The sky split open in a way it had not all season. Rain came down in needles that drummed on the tin roof like an army. The kitchen became a small cave of warmth. The children slept less restlessly with the sound of rain. There is a kind of comfort in the noise when hunger is a whisper and not a shout. Emiliano sat by the window and watched the sheets of water make tracks down the glass. The storm felt almost like a blessing, water swelling in the cistern's belly, the promise of new shoots. Yet it made the chores harder and the night colder for those without meat. Aurelia stayed the night. As the rain pounded, they heard a sudden sharper commotion out in the corral. A scream, a horse's panicked cry. Emiliano was moving before he even thought. Boots on, jacket over, the weight of a man who has no other safety but the swiftness of his limbs. A colt had broken through a loose post and tangled its leg in the rail. The animal reared and crashed, the sound of splintering wood, a broken cord in the rain. Mateo had run to the barn door with a lantern, pale-faced and small. Emiliano waded through the mud and the dark, hands slick on wet boards, and did what a man must when danger is immediate. He put himself between the animal and the foal. He stayed low, spoke in the low voice he used to calm children. He slid a loop of rope and found a way to ease the colt's panic, risked the narrow ledge of the corral, and his shoulder collided with a rotten beam that gave with a sound like breaking ribs. He felt the blow later, in the quiet after the child was safe and the colt tethered. There was a sting and a bruise that bloomed across his side. Aurelia helped him back to the house, her hands sure and efficient. She stripped his wet coat off in the shadow of the kitchen light, and Emiliano watched her worry not at him, but at the bruise, as if determining whether it was something he could carry on with. She said nothing about men who ride hard, or about ideas that might save them. She only tended, which is a kind of language. The next morning the ledger of consequences in the town office advanced its hand. The sheriff's deputy came with an air of official business, and the quiet satisfaction of someone paid by structure. A list was read aloud, an inventory. If Emiliano could not provide feed, the tied cattle would be seized and sold at auction to satisfy outstanding notes. The children listened from the doorway, their faces ghostly in the bright light. Tears did not fall. Rosa rubbed her wrists together as if trying to make warmth. Word moved in the way it always did in small towns. One neighbor told another, and whispers found the wind. Some offered small kindnesses, eggs, a jar of sugar, but none had enough to fill the gap. The community's goodwill was not a reservoir. It was a stream that could wet a foot but not water a field. When the deputy left, Lorenzo stayed behind. He had been measuring things in his head: interest, time, the profit from a man's ruin. He watched Emiliano with an appraising air, and then crouched like a predator deciding whether to strike. "You know what you can do, Emiliano," he said. "There are options." "I know everything," Emiliano replied, and the words are softer than he feels. In truth, he did know more than Lorenzo suspected, knew the shape of the land, knew the weather's turns, knew how long children could go without meat and not die but become other people because of that going. He knew the taste of the last biscuit in a pocket and the hollow echo of a pantry. He had been saving, selling, bartering. He had been making small bridges where others burned planks for warmth. Lorenzo's eyes had learned how to read people's small debts, how a man might owe his honor to one thing or his house to another. He offered things in terms of contracts and the bottom line. He had a man's way of saying, without melodrama, that choices had costs, and the coin that buys food sometimes asks for a life in exchange. "You could sign with me," Lorenzo said. "Sign and I'll give you feed through winter. You'll sign the deed over until you can pay me back, if ever." Emiliano's hands tightened in his pockets. He thought of his name stamped on that paper, of Lucia's hands folded across him when she had said goodbye. He thought of countless small things that anchored them to the place. The spot of the porch where the rose bush died each summer, and the circle where a saddle had always hung. Land was not merely soil in value, it was repository of memory. To hand it away would be to fold away the last of Lucia's place in the world for reasons that the ledger might call necessary and the heart call ruin. "You could ride?" Lorenzo continued, as if the words were a reassurance. "The South Road cuts off 3 days. Dangerous, sure, but you're a good rider. You could bring grain home and keep your land. Or I can ride a month straight in the flat with strangers, leave my children with another man and return with coin," Emiliano said. The choices were sharp trees in winter, each a solitude. Lorenzo watched him, and then, with a small, almost genteel shrug, left an extra business card on the counter. "Think on it," he said. 10 days. The number circled Emiliano's sleep that night like a fly hovering the candle. 10. It was both long and short. He paced the floor, took up the old rifle for the comfort of weight, set it down again. The children slept in the front room with a blanket folded between them. He sat and listened to the quiet that descended after a farm is put to bed. The storm had brought some relief, moisture in the dirt, a puddle at the back of the yard, but it also made things slick with complication. He thought of Lucia's last words, small and sullen as a verse. He thought of how she had braided Rosa's hair for the last time and hummed a tune that didn't belong to any church. She had told him once, when they were younger and poor and promising each other a future, "We do what keeps them." It was not a vow, it was a method of surviving. He had kept that promise with the quiet imperatives of a man who knows only how to show love through doing. He called Aurelia in the morning and asked her for one of those favors she had given without accounting. "Watch them," he said. His voice was pared down. He wanted not to explain the whole of it to her, not to make her the keeper of every fear. "If I must go, watch them." She did not balk. "I'm not your charity," she said, "but I know how to mind children." "You'll be paid," he said, and it was not the kind of promise a man makes lightly. "You'll be gone a few days. Don't go thinking you can come back with everything solved," she answered, with a little dry curve of a smile. "Make the trip count." He had been thinking about the South Road, about the drive and the thing men spoke of with both appetite and fear. The idea of riding the cut had the kind of truth that did not lie. It was shorter, more dangerous, not a legal route, but a practical one. There were bandits, yes, but there were also chances. Chances were not promises, though. Emiliano had been reading the map of risk like a man reading a tide. He could not sleep on the idea of a deed signed into Lorenzo's possession, could not bear the slow corrosion of absence if he joined a drive that took him far from the kids. The cut offered a narrow line, a way to bring grain home faster, to get cash for feed without mortgaging what his family had left. He stood at the threshold of a choice that would change not just the winter, but the shape of their lives. He felt the pull like an old bruise. He thought of the mare's muscles under his hands, the way she would catch a scent and push on. He could sense the land as if it were a living thing. The decision he made would be a wound or a blessing. Morning came when he still hadn't decided. The children slept at his feet while he saddled the mare in the cool light. Aurelia watched him saddle, went to get the water, checked the ropes. Together they packed a small sack, 2 days' rations, a blanket, some coin he had pressed together in weeks of trading. Emiliano could not bring more without risking notice. He had to be stealthy, not because it was shameful to leave. It wasn't. It was because the town's eyes were as sharp as Lorenzo's, and rumor could do what Ritz could not, turn favors into suspicions. "Who will mind them if you must go longer?" she asked as she closed the door. "Neighbors," he said. "Old Thomas promised to check once a day. You must stay as long as you can. Rosa and Mateo need someone to tell them it'll be okay. You'll come back." Her words were not a request. They were an assertion. "I will come back," he said. He did not make the kind of vow that dreams of certainty. He made a vow of intention. It was all he had. At the edge of the property, where the road met the horizon, Emiliano paused. The mare shifted her weight as if impatient. Even animals understand the costume of urgency. He looked back at the house. Curtains fluttered, the children's small heads a-slow up and down behind the glass. He felt the small iron in his chest tighten. He thought of the things he owned, some mislaid tools, a silver locket with a picture of Lucia, the deed in a ledger book in the top drawer, and he made a calculation that lived half in his head and half in his chest. He would not sign with Lorenzo. He would try the cut. Aurelia put her hand on his shoulder in that slow way that held without pressing. "Come back in one piece," she said. There were other words unsaid. "Don't be foolish, don't die, come back," and she kept them tucked to herself. Emiliano had a sense, in that instant, of how small his life could be reduced to gestures. Leaving felt like removing himself from the center of everything he'd ever promised to hold. Before dawn the next day, under a thin smear of moonlight and the cold that makes breath visible, Emiliano mounted. He had left Rosa a small note folded in the pocket of his jacket. "Feed Mateo, window for light, don't open the west gate." He had given Aurelia instructions and his blessing. The mare tested the reins and pulled him toward the road that would take him south. The cut lay ahead like a question. Old songs about it clung to the hills, warnings wrapped in melody, rumors worn thin with telling. No decent man in town rode that road in winter, certain men said. Even Lorenzo had not gone that way. Emiliano felt the weight of lore and possibility at his knees. He had learned that despair robs a man of fear less quickly than it does of love. It made him braver in the face of what he must do. He eased the mare down the lane. The light was the blue of an old bruise. As he left the house behind and took the path that cut through scrub, past the broken fence, the pile of winter wood waiting unstacked, he felt the land close around him like hands that wanted him back. He did not know if the decision would be met with gratitude or with ruin. He only knew it was his, blunt and clear as the iron of the bit. On the ridge, the town blushed awake with a single lantern here and a curtain there. Emiliano sat for a while, letting the mare rest, listening to the slow life behind him. He thought, briefly, of Lucia's face in the photograph he carried in his shirt pocket, the way she had always looked like she was somewhere else, and yet always coming back. He pressed his thumb to the worn edge of the paper, and felt the ridges like a promise. Then he nudged the mare forward, and the dirt swallowed the print of their boots. The cut opened beneath them, a line of darker earth and fewer marks of travel. The wind was a finger at his ear, and the mare's breath came in hot puffs. He rode into a shadowed road that had more stories than a town preacher. Behind him, through the thin walls, Rosa and Mateo stirred and then slept again. Aurelia watched from the frame of the doorway until the mare and man were one dark shape, then another, until both were gone. The house settled into its small ritual of daylight. A neighbor's dog barked, the chickens clucked, the machinery of survival moved on. Emiliano had taken the first step of the extreme thing he had decided upon. He had chosen a route that was dangerous, a choice that might save the children's stomachs but cost him something else. Safety, perhaps his standing, perhaps worse. In the morning light, he had looked like any man who rides with a job to do. But the road was not the job. The road was the decision made manifest. As he pushed into the dark, the world closed ranks around him, and the shape of the next days settled like a question with teeth. Stay until the end to see the desperate thing he does to save them. The cut narrowed and wound through the hills. The trees here were sparse, like the land recovering from hunger. Stones lay exposed and sharp. Once the man who rode this road had to be careful with every step. The ground would eat a hoof if you were not attentive. Emiliano rode slow. The rain of last week had left puddles that shimmered like hip-deep mirrors. He kept his eyes on the horizon and his hands steady on the reins. Bandit talk was a thing told by campfires to scare boys into respect. Reality, he supposed, would be quieter. 2 men in a ditch, knives half hidden, the smell of cheap whiskey on their breath. He could plan for some kinds of danger, not for every kind. A mile out, he found a carcass, an old rusted wagon wedged against a drift of scrub, its wheel half rotten. Someone once had tried to make that route into a road. That failure, like the last baked bread, told him what men had done before. He felt the smallness of any individual plan. The mare threaded her way between rocks. They were alone in a country of possible dangers, a human smallness against the wide, patient earth. By noon he saw smoke in the distance, not the thin white of kitchens, but the dark curl of a campfire. A man stepped out, hat whipped by wind, a rifle over his shoulder. Emiliano slowed and raised his hand in the small language of a traveler. The man looked him over and then nodded. "No trouble?" Emiliano called. The man looked over the mare as if measuring whether they had provisions to trade or whether they were a danger. "Depends how you look at it," he replied. His accent carried the roughness of a life taken on the road. "Riders don't come this way no more without reasons." "I'm taking grain to town," Emiliano said. It was the truth and not the whole of it. Words could be as useful as bread if they were the right kind. The man grunted. "Ain't seen merchants. You're heading south?" "South," Emiliano confirmed. The man's gaze went to the pack on Emiliano's saddle. "You'd best keep your pockets closed. Not everyone likes strangers." He offered the kind of advice that came with a price, caution. Emiliano thanked him and rode on, a knot of uneasy awareness in his gut. The road sloped down into a valley where wind moved like a silver hand across scrub. For a moment, Emiliano allowed himself to imagine success. Grain stacked in the back of the wagon, the mare's belly full, the house warm with soup. Love, he thought, is often the name we give to the things we will brave. He kept the image close as a fuel. It would see him through. As he rode, his mind came back, inevitable and unwelcome, to the ledger of debts. The deed, the notice, the quiet eyes that measured him like a man measuring a piece of salt. The choice he had made was a public one. He had left a man's footprint in town, had given Lorenzo something to chisel at in his absence. He imagined town gossip snatching at the story, a man gone on a dangerous road, threads attaching to it and turning it into either madness or heroism depending on who told it. The sun moved like a slow coin across the sky. Emiliano stopped at lunchtime to let the mare graze on some sparse grass. He ate a small piece of bread and a slice of dried meat and thought of Rosa's thin ankles, of Mateo's quiet hand on his sleeve. There is a way hunger compounds in time. It makes small hours into mountains. He thought of the children's faces when he had left them, sleeping, trusting, a kind of belief that could make a man feel unworthy. Down the road the land grew rougher, and the air tasted of iron and dust. He rode with his hand half on his rifle, an old comfort and an old necessity. Men on this road prefer their solitude and distrust strangers who come at dusk. He had prepared, set the mare's pads, wrapped his coat tight against whatever night might bite. But preparation was a poor shield against fate. At dusk he reached a way station, an old stone crossing where the road met a shallow creek. A small group of riders were there. They eyed him with varying degrees of suspicion and curiosity. One of them was a broad-shouldered man with a tattoo on his wrist and a laugh like a broken chain. Emiliano realized, without fanfare, that the people who traveled these roads had faces like him, weathered, careful, eyes that had seen affronts and had learned to keep score. He dismounted and tied the mare, letting the animal drink from the creek. The riders offered little conversation initially. It was the kind of place where men told stories by small favors. handing a cup of water across, offering a scrap of jerky. The man with the tattoo came near and regarded Emiliano over the fire. "You look like you're keeping something," the tattooed man said. "Not keeping," Emiliano answered, trying to find. "That's the same thing," the man said. "Tell me, do you believe in luck?" "I believe in trying," Emiliano said. He did not mention the children. The men around the fire had sons and daughters somewhere, maybe. Some had given them away, some had buried them. He had learned that sharing certain truths with strangers invited them to become more immediate than a man might want. "You don't look like the soft sort," someone else remarked. "What takes you this far?" He thought of telling them, of saying he had 2 children starving, that he had left them in the care of a friend, and ridden toward a merchant he had heard rumor of. He thought of how sounds change story into a commodity. He kept the truth small. Need grain. The men talked then of the road, of who had passed and who had been lost. There were stories, always there are stories, of men who had been robbed, but of men who had taken back more than they lost. Every camp has its myths. Emiliano listened and added nothing until the talk slowed to embers. When they asked where he was headed and he mentioned the merchant, the man with the tattoo drew his thumb along the rim of his cup, looked at him directly and said, "You should be careful. There's a wagon ahead coming from a merchant." "You should be careful. There's a wagon ahead coming from a merchant," the tattooed man said, tapping ash into the dirt and staring into the thin smoke as if he could see the future in it. Emiliano felt the words like a skein being pulled taut. Ahead, the road cut down into a hollow, and in the hollow a curl of smoke lifted steady and low. He gave the mare a loose rein, and let her pick her own pace. The cut did not welcome hurry. It punished the clumsy and the careless. He kept his hat low, not out of fear of being seen, but because the light glared, and because letting your face be read made bargaining harder than it needed to be. As the wagon came into view, the first thing Emiliano noticed was the quality of the cloth covering it. New canvas, the scent of oil and fresh rope. Merchants did not usually show such tidy things on roads like this. Around the wagon were 2 men who wore the look of hired muscle, thick wrists from rope, palms that had known the bite of reins and the sting of lashes. Between them walked a smaller man in a fine faded coat, who introduced himself with a slight bow. "Don Rafael," the small man said, politeness pressed into his voice the way a coin gets polished. He had the neat, controlled smile of someone used to measuring speech before spending it. A name tag, if you liked names, and a ledger tucked into his vest. Emiliano stopped a good 20 paces away, hands resting on the saddle horn. The mare snorted. Don Rafael's eyes slid over him like a knife over a saddle. Quick, efficient, measuring. "You're on the cut," Don Rafael observed. "Not many take it for pleasure." "I'm trying to get south," Emiliano replied. "Shorter route." "For safe passage, for coin," Don Rafael said. "We keep our prices. We don't sell to travelers. Grain goes to towns and large buyers. But we do make arrangements for men willing to come under contract." The men with him snorted, as if the word contract disguised teeth. A contract on the cut meant you were bargaining with certainty and peril at once. Emiliano considered turning away. The option Lorenzo had left, mortgage, pledge a deed, hung like a fresh bruise under his sternum. Signing himself away for a season at some far ranch was an idea he had allowed himself in darker moments, but to stand here and barter his labor against sacks of flour and corn felt like stepping into a new kind of weather. "How long?" he asked. "Depends on the need," Don Rafael said. He produced a small scrap of paper and unfolded it with a showman's care. "Seasonal labor, 3 months to a year. You get board, lodging, and a stipend. Enough to buy grain and a little extra." He pronounced little, like a man choosing exactly how much pity to allow into a negotiation. "You bind yourself to us," the tattooed man added, leaning forward. "You work, you ride our lines, you keep the peace. In return you get the provisions you need, and your family gets a share. It's honest work." His voice carried no malice, only the kind of simple calculus that has kept men from starving in worse winters. Emiliano thought of Rosa's thin legs under the table and Mateo's small shoulders. He held the mare's reins until the leather hot under his hands seemed to burn. "And if I sign," he said finally, "I'm gone for the season." "Gone and fed," Don Rafael corrected. "You come back whole, or at least you come back with enough left to keep the house for better men." The words were a kind of contract inside a contract. They were true, and they were thin. "What about land?" Emiliano asked. He used the idea like a talisman, testing whether it might turn their terms. Land was the one thing that felt holy enough he could not trade it easily. Don Rafael looked at him with an almost indifferent curiosity. "We don't take deeds, we take work. Men keep what laws their home gives them. We're merchants, not mortgagers." That at first felt like salvation. Emiliano's throat loosened, a heat that was half relief, half shame. He had wanted to avoid the ledger's bite upon his home. A season of labor, if it came back stitched together, could be the right kind of sacrifice. He would trade his presence, not his inheritance. He could live with that kind of absence if it meant his children did not hollow away. It would be a strange penance. The house would stand, and the children would have food because their father had gone to be someone's hand for months. But Don Rafael's next sentence tightened the rope. "We will take you on our own terms," he said. "You sign for a year, you ride with our caravans, you guard our loads, or we sell the grain in town and we give it to you for transport costs and fees. The balance will be laid out in ledger. If you fail the contract, some penalties apply. You understand?" Emiliano nodded. Rules in ink could be fairer than the whims of men with ledgers like Lorenzo's. Still, there was another detail Don Rafael seemed reluctant to say. His men did business with Lorenzo. The merchant had mentioned in passing merchants preferring cash or trade in good standing. That phrase had tasted like someone else's hand in the pot. "You work our line," Don Rafael added, "and we'll deliver provisions to your family. We send someone to take them to your home, or you come to collect at the next town. Choose." Emiliano felt again that small, stubborn ache of choosing how to be a father. To give himself was to give something immediate and honest. To give the deed would be to hand down a wound that might never heal. He flexed his hands against the leather and thought of Lucia's voice in the small pantry, those recorded memories that had become law in his chest. "We do what keeps them." It was not a prayer for grandness or a scripture for sacrifice beyond reason. It was a method of survival. "All right," he said, and the word felt like a narrowing bridge. "I'll sign for a season." They set the terms. Don Rafael wrote with quick, precise strokes, the ink making black answers appear on the paper like evidence. Emiliano signed with the same careful hand that signed receipts and small repairs. He felt the realness of the ink on his fingers as if it were brand. He did not sign away his land. He signed himself. The tattooed man rolled over an agreement in which Emiliano would ride with the merchant convoy for a full year, guarding loads along the South Road, keeping watch, doing repairs, and performing any task that required a rough hand and a steady horse. He would be paid a modest monthly stipend. He would receive extra supplies before his departure to leave with his family. If he broke his word or deserted, a clause required recompense. Terms Emiliano knew the law would enforce harder on a man alone than on a merchant who carried coin. The shame and relief braided into one when Don Rafael extended a cheap cigar and a small heavy sack of corn and flour, enough to fill the pantry and then some. "We send a wagon to your town," Don Rafael said. "Tell your people to be waiting." Emiliano accepted the sack like a sacrament. The smell of grain, raw, honest, felt almost holy. He thought of the children's mouths and of Lucia's rough hands, of storms and colds and mornings when nothing in the house warmed. He wrapped the sack in a burlap blanket and felt the weight of his bargain like an animal under his coat. "You'll be missed," Don Rafael observed with a small sincerity that lacked anything like sentiment. "And they'll be alive," Emiliano answered. The sentence was iron and thread. He had paid his price. The ride back along the cut felt different. Where before there had been the fear of bandits and the hum of unknown futures, now there was a new lightness mixed with the strangest displacement. He had agreed to be absent. He had purchased the certainty of their bellies for the known price of his voice at the breakfast table. It was a trade. He had bartered his time for their survival. The mare moved with the careful steps of an animal that knows it is carrying more than weight. She carried a man with a wound he had given himself. Town looked smaller when he came in under the evening. Word had already begun to move in the peculiar speed of gossip. Lorenzo's name hung on tongues like a coin with a bite. Emiliano felt the town's eyes, some flat with measurement, others with something like approval. He rode to the house with the sack of grain strapped under his arm and his hands high on the reins, and when Aurelia saw him ride in, her expression cracked open like a door. "You did it," she said. Her voice carried a wonder that was half gratitude and half fear. She stepped forward before he could dismount, her hands sure and quick. She took the sack from him as if it were a living thing that must be treated with courtesy. "They'll send a wagon," he told her. "Take what you must now. There's enough in here to last until the wagon comes. Then there'll be more." Aurelia's mouth was a thin line for one breath and then eased into something softer. "You promised," she said, but not as if he had broken a vow. It was a reminder of what he had chosen. That night they boiled a thin stew and ate from the same tin plate that had been empty in the morning. The children's faces softened in the way a drought softens when it finally rains. Their bodies were not whole in an instant, but the immediate cavern of hollow that had sat in their bellies quieted into patience. Rosa's fingers, small and warm, wrapped around a dry crust. Mateo ate with a concentration as if he had been taught to be careful with miracles. Emiliano sat at the table and watched them while the stew steamed and the light thinned. He had done something extreme. He had given himself away for a season. The wall of the house held the photographs and the small relics of lives that would endure his absence. He had not given away their home. He had not yet given away their name. But the cost was there, no less sharp because it had not been written on paper and handed to another man. He would be gone. Sunday breakfasts would miss the kettle's whistle and the particular way he traced nails and told small stories. He would miss the learning of their voices as they grew and the quiet duties of a father who was there to fix scraped knees. And even more, he would miss the slow, ordinary presence that counts for more than coin. "That clock keeps the same time whether you're here or not," Aurelia said softly as she stacked plates. For a moment a shared humor passed between them. He had known she would not try to conceal the fact that his absence would open a pressure on her, but she was willing to bear it. She would not be their mother, but she would be their caretaker in some ways. The economy of small towns is a network of these unsung bargains. Morning came with the steady lines of work to be done before travel. Emiliano slept little that night, folding plans and knots in his mind. The wagon did indeed arrive as Don Rafael had promised. 2 men from the convoy, burly, efficient, brought an extra supply, a sack of flour, salted pork, sugar enough to sweeten coffee for a time. They set the supplies down like an altar, the town's scarcity yielding to the merchant's reach. The men took a ledger, crossed out the grain's movement, and left as if they had merely turned a page. Lorenzo watched the delivery from his shop window and then came to the house with a gait like a man preparing to haggle with fate. He stood under the porch and did not immediately speak. His presence was the same as ever, measured, a man without a great display of heat. He removed his hat, kept it at his side, and measured Emiliano as if measuring a commodity. "So this is what you do," Lorenzo said finally. "Go look for work and send your family scraps. Noble, practical." Emiliano did not hasten to defend the choice. He had made it and felt the choice's precise edges. "They have food," he said. It was plain, the kind of sentence that sealed a deal. "For now," Lorenzo said, "you trade your arms to merchants and your name to the road. It's a good trade if you're not planning on coming home." "You don't have to advise me on fatherhood," Emiliano said. There was a sharpness that rose like a stone, but he kept his voice steady. He would not give Lorenzo the satisfaction of plucking at his soft places. Lorenzo's eyes narrowed. "Wise man knows what to keep. You could have signed the deed, kept your pride, but then you'd have had a home you couldn't afford." The sentence was a kind of swoop, Lorenzo offering indictment disguised as counsel. "And you'd have got your land," Emiliano answered, jaw set. He had always known in a more private way what men like Lorenzo did. They turned misfortune into fortunes. It was the way the world tilted. Emiliano had chosen, with shaking hands, to tilt himself rather than the house, and he would carry the consequences. "You think you did them a favor?" Lorenzo asked, as if rhetoric could sting. "I'll tell you this, men leave plenty and come back less. You watch what quiet does to a name." Emiliano said nothing then. Words would not be meat. He had made his vows to the ledger and to his children. He had made a vow to Lucia somewhere in the etched memory kept under the thin glass of a locket. He would keep them safe. The economy of things is sometimes a cruel language, but he had no illusions that his decision would charm everyone. At dawn, Emiliano packed his thin bag the convoy had provided. The mare, which would not go with him beyond the first leg, no, it would stay with the children, shifted a hoof and nosed his hand. He touched her neck and felt the warmth like a benediction. Aurelia had tied small bundles that were not food, socks, a warmed wool mitten, a frayed glove, things a man on the road would need more than silver. Rosa hid a small ribbon in his shirt where he would find it later and tuck it into a palm-like contraband. Mateo gave him a hand-carved wooden horse, a crude thing but heavy with meaning. "I'll be back," Emiliano told them, and his voice caught with a kind of honest falter. He had no way to promise the future, only to swear in the way men can that they will try. Kissing their foreheads was an action he had performed 1,000 times. That morning each kiss felt like pressing a seal. Aurelia walked him to the road and paused there, silent. In the doorway behind her, the two children watched, their faces already on the soft edge of missing him. When Aurelia spoke, it was not flattery or a hollow comfort. "Keep your head down," she said. "Come back for the mornings." He looked at her, seeing the small scaffolding of worry and steadiness that had come to mean shelter. There had been an unspoken thread between them in the months she had stayed. She offered practical care, and he had offered trust without words. He had not promised anything more. In the silence there was no deals and no claims. Aurelia's hand lingered for a moment on his forearm, a simple human touch. He felt both the comfort and the loneliness of that touch. "I will," he said. Then he mounted and was away, the road closing behind him. Travel with Don Rafael's convoy was different from a lone ride. Men moved with a rhythm set by horses and wagons. Nights were kept in small circles around fires. Emiliano learned the songs and the small codes. Who kept watch when, how to mend a broken wheel under the same light you ate under, how to keep one's thoughts small enough not to drown another's. Work filled the long days, unloading in towns, repairing harnesses, standing watch when the high country held a particular silence that meant trouble. Yet every night when the convoy pitched its small camp, Emiliano would lie on his back and imagine the house he had left. He would think of the way the kitchen smelled when Aurelia baked the thin bread, of Rosa's small hands sticky with jam, of Mateo translating the world into the slow grammar of children. The ache of not being there sat like a stone in his chest. He had traded presents for food and watched the barter unfold inside him. A month into the work, he received a letter brought by a rider who passed through their camp. Aurelia's handwriting ran small and practical across the paper. She had written of the children. They slept more normally now. Mateo had found a kitten in a barn and took it under his small wing. Rosa had been reading aloud from a tattered book she'd found. She had written of Lorenzo. He had increased interest on the outstanding notes, but the town lacked the funds to take the cattle. Small kindnesses had been offered, a jar of preserves, a neighbor who'd loaned old boots, but the ledger kept its face. Emiliano read the words by the light of the fire, thumb keeping the crease in the paper like a little talisman. The letter was the sort of thing that kept a man from becoming a ghost. It gave him edges and names to return to. He felt how the trade, his absence, had given them space to eat. He had no illusions that his choice was noble in some clean way. He had merely chosen a type of necessary obscenity of sacrifice that fathers sometimes inherit. Not all of the news was small and kind. Word traveled that Lorenzo had been pressing the sheriff to auction off a small parcel of their land. An unpaid fee on a note Emiliano had imagined was too small to matter. The parcel in question was not the house, but a strip of grazing that kept the mare fat through springs. Emiliano tightened his jaw at the thought. A man's absence could make his land vulnerable in unexpected ways. He wrote back, short sentences, careful orders, an insistence that Aurelia keep an eye on any writs. The convoy moved on. Towns came and went. The months wore along like rope through hands. Emiliano learned the particular competency of a hired guard, how to sleep light, how to sweat a harness into silence, how to make a small meal stretch. He saw deeds done both honorable and disgraceful. Men in the caravans were not saints. They were tradesmen and survivors. Some of them had names and children who had been left behind for reasons of survival and not choice. Emiliano kept to himself at first, but found a few shoulders that matched his steadiness. There was a man named Saito, a hard-eyed rider who had once been a blacksmith in a city now far behind him. There was also a woman named Magdalena who cooked with fire like a priest. they became small constellations in his nights. Meanwhile, back in town, Aurelia kept the house as one tends a fragile flame. She mended clothes with a relentless patience, kept the children in rhythms, read to them at night, and answered the questions of neighbors who had more curiosity than charity. Children are quick to notice absences. Rosa drew pictures of a father on the road that were all boots and horizon. Mateo clung to his small wooden horse and would sometimes press it to the place where his father had kissed him last, as if the wood could carry warmth. Then, one cold morning in late winter, months after Emiliano had gone, a rider came, dusty and breathless. He carried a small scrap of news in a leather case. He told Aurelia in a low voice that the sheriff had backed off from immediate seizure for the present winter, that Lorenzo had raised the interest, and that the town's temper was turning. People were beginning to see Emiliano's decision as both brave and foolish. Some praised it in whispers, others used it as evidence of a man who could be pushed. Aurelia did not let the knowledge become an argument in the house. She saw to the pantry and kept the children warm. She visited the town's small chapel and borrowed the candled light for a moment longer than was necessary. She wrote to Emiliano and spoke in plain relief of the small survival. They were eating more regularly, the mayor would likely be fine, and the neighbor Thomas kept watch on Ritz. The letter was both a comfort and a reminder. The time came when the convoy reached a large depot where a winter auction would be held, where the meat and grain of entire regions changed hands. Emiliano had grown into the rhythm of work. He had, in his absence, found small things he would miss. A sunrise in a country he had not known, the way a stranger might hand you a cup and ask nothing in return, the quiet competence of someone who knows how to mend a broken wheel without asking for accolades. The work was exacting, and it taught him that sacrifice was a series of small actions as well as one large one. At the depot, the conversation of men turned to things that felt close to Emiliano. There was talk of supply, and of Lorenzo's rising interest, and of rivers of goods that moved with merchants like Don Rafael. He found himself specifying to a clerk where to register the provisions for his family and how to ensure they were sent. Paper, and the ability to place a mark, was a language he had learned. He wrote instructions so meticulous someone might think he'd never plan to return. The clerk nodded and stamped forms. The machinery of commerce moved with little regard for sentiment. Then, in the middle of a day full of rope and commerce, a barked command split the air. A group of men in town livery, Lorenzo's livery with a subtle crest, had come to the depot with a writ. They were looking for goods to seize on a claim made by the general store. Emiliano watched as men moved to intercept the wagons. The air tasted like copper and the possibility of confrontation. He felt, in that instant, the old sensation that had gotten him out of bed on the day he chose the cut. Urgency. He rode toward the scene, not because he intended to fight for his goods in some spectacle. He rode because, having chosen this life for months, his responsibility now was not abstract. The caravan commanders addressed Lorenzo's men with a quiet composure. They had contracts and receipts. The men from town barked about notes due and the law. It was the sort of argument that usually ended with ledgers balanced in a merchant's favor. But the caravan men had the strength of numbers and a simple legal posture. They had no claim on stores already paid for or otherwise accounted for. Lorenzo's face was there among the crowd like a stamp. He did not strike with his hand. He only showed a ledger and the competence of a man accustomed to closing books. Emiliano found himself stepping forward and speaking with a calm he had not felt in months, but which came naturally now that he had become the kind of man who kept watch. "These are Don Rafael's goods," Emiliano said. "They're accounted for." He had the right feel now to stand, to say the thing that could keep a wagon moving and some crumbs on a table. The sheriff came to the argument and checked the receipts. The writ was real, and some goods were at risk, but the caravan's paper showed the rest. No one fired a gun. The law did its slow work. Commerce never truly dies. When Lorenzo's men left, with a few sacks under their arms but not the whole lot, he looked at Emiliano again as if to appraise. "You rode for the choice you made," he said. "Fine, but remember, a man's pride does not feed him longer than a ledger." Emiliano said nothing. The exchange had a razor of consequence. Lorenzo had attempted to take through legal means what he could not take in the immediate rush. Emiliano felt the strain. He had chosen to be the man who would offer his time rather than his land, But his absence had opened vulnerabilities he could not foresee. The world, it seemed, found ways to barter against the very things he had not thought to protect. Spring crept in slow after that, and with spring came a kind of patience. The supplies Don Rafael had arranged were being delivered to the house as per their agreement. The children were less gaunt. They began to run in a way that only children allowed themselves when the pantry had a kind of promise. Emiliano, in his place with the convoy, wrote letters and sent extra coins when he could. There were times of scarcity where a single coin arrived and the house felt like a different world for a week. Aurelia wrote back, not in epistles of longing but in the plain news of small things: windows repaired, a neighbor's cow lent for a week, Rosa beginning to sing. Months passed like seasons stitched together. Emiliano learned the names of the merchant roads, how to read the sun at midday when stones bled heat, and how to make small surgical repairs on harnesses in a light that was not his own. He stood guard under moonlight when the world around him seemed to hold its breath. Sometimes he would allow himself to think of coming home. Sometimes he would think of choosing another sacrifice. But at night, the picture of Rosa asleep with the ribbon in her hair and Mateo clutching a wooden horse steeled him against fatigue and fear. And then, unexpectedly, on a pale morning when the convoy was crossing a shallow ford, a rider from their town appeared, breathless and wide-eyed. He had news that demanded immediate ink. Emiliano took the letter like a man accepting an order from fate. Aurelia's handwriting leapt off the page in familiar strokes. Her first lines were small and quick. "Be home, now." His hands were steady as he rode back alone, leaving the caravan to its course. The road home folded itself out like a path a man knows by memory, even when the world changes. He rode hard, pushing the mare until she moved with a will that matched his. When he came into the house, the sight that greeted him landed with a new kind of weight. Lorenzo's men were there, not to take goods this time, but because someone had produced a writ of imminent foreclosure on a piece of the property. The sheriff stood with a small group, and the town watched like the sea watches a ship go by. The writ was for a narrow strip of land, but tidings had come that Lorenzo planned to press further. Emiliano dismounted and felt the ground under his boots like an old covenant. He went to the door and found Aurelia standing there, hands clenched but composed. The children were within, the house filled with a brittle quiet. When Lorenzo spoke, he spoke with a calm that had the edge of a man who always knows how a story will end. "You signed yourself away," Lorenzo said, addressing Emiliano as if he had been gone too long and come back as a lesson to others. "You gave up presents. Now you've returned and find the law moves on. The town is practical." Emiliano stepped forward. He had been absent, but absence did not annul duty. He had chosen a way to keep them fed. He had not expected his sacrifice to also become a public battle. The two things could stand together. He could be both a man who had given himself to the road and a man who now refused to let the law take their home at the same time. "I paid for what I could," Emiliano said calmly. "I traded time for grain, but this house is ours. You can present the law for what it is, but I will not allow you to take what keeps them warm." Lorenzo smiled in that way that had made Emiliano angry for months. "You'll have to go through the process," Lorenzo said. "Law moves slow, but it is steady." "That's fine," Emiliano replied. "So is patience. Words have weight. Sometimes it is enough to stand to be enough." The sheriff looked back and forth at the men, at the papers, then at the assembled neighbors. He was a man with a sense of paper's power and a taste for preventing spectacle. There was talk. There were examination of the ledger entries, the merchant records, and the convoy's delivery receipts. Aurelia produced a piece of paper Don Rafael's clerk had left, a receipt that helped clarify that grain had arrived and had been accounted for. It was not absolute protection, but it meant the law would have its work cut out. Town moved slowly after that day. The sheriff took the writ and promised to look into the mercantile dispute with careful hands. Lorenzo was not a man to be easily deterred. He returned to his shop, and his shadow lengthened into a season. Emiliano, having done what he could with words and presence, resolved to remain at his post for a time longer, not out of duty owed to the merchant, but because presence mattered. The months until Emiliano's original year with Don Rafael's convoy concluded were long and full. He rode back at last with the trappings of a man who had been sufficiently tested. He had worked under a sun that had burned the back of his neck, and in nights whose cold made a man dream of small comforts. The first glimpse of his house through the lanes was a sight that cut the breath out of him, sudden and sweet. He rode up slow, no gallop, because horses and men both understand the decorum of returns. Children spilled out when he tied the mare. Mateo ran first, the wooden horse clattering against the ground, Rosa behind him, and their small faces were not changed by years but by months. They looked like his children again. Aurelia stood in the doorway, looking at him as if evaluating both what he had done and what he had become. The porch felt warm beneath his boots. "You came back," Rosa said simply, her voice bright as a bell. "And I'm hungry," Mateo added, not shy of stating facts. Emiliano crouched and took them both into his arms. Their bodies fit against him as if they had been waiting for his shape to return. The house smelled of bread and lavender, of things Aurelia had kept for their small comforts. He realized then that the exchange he had made had been paid in full by 1,000 small attentions from her, from neighbors, and by the stubborn breath of his children. He had given himself away, and what he got back was a room full of lives that had not been stolen in his absence. Lorenzo watched from across the lane, hands in his pockets. His face told no single story. There were still accounts with his name on them and interest to be counted. He walked up with a ledger folded under his arm. "You came back with a story," he said. "I came back with my children," Emiliano replied. He set the wooden horse in the boy's hands and looked Lorenzo in the eyes. Lorenzo's features shifted slightly, something like a respect or a recalibrated appraisal of a man whose methods were not his own. He had tried to push, but Emiliano's absence had not led to ruin. It had led to a kind of messy survival that did not fit easily into an account book. For all Lorenzo's appetite for taking advantage, sometimes the world resisted tidy conclusions. "You made a decision," Lorenzo said at last. "A dangerous one." "A dangerous one," Emiliano agreed. "But it fed them." Lorenzo folded his ledger and left without another word. It was the sort of retreat that felt like both a wound and a pause. The town would speak of Emiliano's choice in one way or another for a long time. Some called it folly, others courage. But for Emiliano the matter had been simple. He had done what kept them. The community's judgment would not alter the reality that sat around his table each night. Aurelia remained a presence in the house, no step beyond what had been given, and no less than the care she had offered. In the months after his return, something like a friendship settled between them, modest and unforced. They mended fences together, drove stakes into weary earth, and shared the small, honest work that made a place habitable. There were moments when they sat in the evening and spoke of nothing more than the weather or a neighbor's cow. Romance, in the town's private gossip, flickered like a candle, but nothing was demanded or promised beyond the mutuality of two people who had known each other in days of need and in days of quiet. Emiliano's wounds were not a currency Aurelia felt compelled to use. The possibility of companionship existed in the room like the possibility of rain, a welcome prospect, but never forced. In the quiet aftermath, Emiliano found himself often on the porch in the early hours with the kettle hissing on a small stove. He watched the children play and considered how the future had narrowed and opened in ways he could hardly have predicted. He still bore the marks of what he had done, calluses, a line of a scar along his forearm, and there were nights he woke with a start at unfamiliar sounds. The trade he had made for his children's well-being sat with him like a good and terrible thing. One afternoon, months after his return, he walked the land he had not given away and found the little strip of grazing that had been threatened. He sat on a fence post with his hat pulled low and thought of Lucia's laugh as if she had been standing just beyond a hill. He thought of the choices men make and how they rewrite the map of their lives. The kids' laughter drifted from the yard, and Aurelia's voice called out instructions for a morning chore. There was work to be done and a life to cultivate, and the sense, finally, that survival had not required the erasure of what made them human. When Lorenzo came to the bar one evening and spoke of accounts in a quieter tone, the two men found their talk contained an odd truce. Lorenzo had not become a friend, he had not even become less formidable. But there was a respect there, the rough recognition that certain lines, once crossed, changed the measure of a man in ways paper could not entirely account for. "You would have given the deed," he said in a low tone. "You could have chosen that." "And I chose not to," Emiliano replied. "I chose to give myself." Lorenzo looked at him, and for once there was no ledger in his eyes, only the slow appraisal of someone who had seen a man take a risk enough to make him an unknown quantity. "You've made your choices," Lorenzo agreed. "Just remember, there's always a price to pay." "We know the price," Emiliano said. It was not a defiance so much as a statement of fact. Life, thereafter, settled into a new series of rhythms. The town did not forget Emiliano's year away. Some whispered that he had been reckless, others that he had been wise. The children grew with a quiet steadiness. Rosa learned to braid and to read aloud. Mateo's wooden horse became less a toy and more a talisman they kept on a shelf. Aurelia and Emiliano kept a careful friendship that honored the lines they had both chosen. There were small confessions in the dark between them, of fear, of gratitude, of how thinly a life can balance, and there was no transaction in any of them beyond mutual respect. Years later, when Rosa was old enough to hold a needle and Mateo big enough to hold down a steer, townsfolk would still tell the story in various hues. Some would say that Emiliano rode a dangerous road and returned a different man. Others would say he had done something extreme and therefore was a figure for parables. But in the kitchen, when the light slanted through the window and the kettle sang, Emiliano would hold a small wooden horse and think back to the night he had signed his name and handed himself over to necessity. He would taste the memory like old coffee, bitter and essential, and he would know, with a clarity that never left him, that the work he had done had been the kind of love that is measured in absence and in the return. Aurelia stayed a presence in their lives. There was an easy tenderness between her and Emiliano that never required names or claims. On cold mornings, she would stand at the stove and pass him a cup of coffee without asking for reasons for the night's silence. Over time, the quiet grew into something neither called by a single name. When Emiliano sat on the porch in the late hours and thought of the times he had ridden the cut, it was this, family, food, and the slow gestures of neighbors that steadied him. In that small town, life carried on. Lorenzo kept his store and his accounts. The sheriff kept his papers. The countryside continued to be a place that required work and demanded payment for its comforts. The lesson that Emiliano's choice left behind was not one of heroics shouted from rooftops. It was quieter, a map of what a man will trade to keep the faces that mattered from hollowing out. He had done something extreme. He had given up what he could bear to give, his presence for a season, his stability for a guarantee of food. The cost had been real and visible in calluses, in the deepening lines at his eyes, in the knowledge that his children had grown some, while they had been fed. One evening, with the sun leaning low and the sky the color of old copper, Emiliano sat with Aurelia and watched Rosa and Mateo chase their shadows across the yard. He felt the small satisfaction of a man who had been tested and had, for the most part, kept his word. He turned to Aurelia and said simply, "They eat." Aurelia smiled, not because the statement was novel, but because it was true. "They do," she agreed, "because you went where a decent man should not, and because you came back." He looked at her, and for a moment they both held the steady silence of people who know the value of the ordinary. Then Aurelia slipped her hand into his, a small, unceremonious gesture. It was not a binding, and it was not a bargain. It was, simply, a recognition. The children ran up and piled small complaints and demands on them both, about bedtime or about chores or about the wooden horse's need for paint. Emiliano laughed then, a clear sound that seemed to remove some dust from the day. He had paid for their lives in the currency he could spare, and he had been returned to them in ways that measured less in wages than in mornings. If anyone in that town asked what he had done, he would tell them the truth. He had chosen a road no decent man preferred, and he had taken the hard bargain for their bellies. The lesson was not a neat one. There was no moral at the end, and the man did not become a legend, except in the small legends that matter to a house. A father who rode away and came back. That was enough. If this story touched you, like and subscribe. Tell us in the comments, how far would you go for your children?